this passage in 1 Peter 2 and this idea of our submission to the authorities as people who are free, as free men on the one hand, but then also as slaves to God, I think it's a much safer, much more helpful place to begin. I think the danger with sphere sovereignty is that as Christians, as those like myself who are given towards a rebellious disposition, the danger for us is to take it and use it as a way of saying to government, you have no authority here. You do not get to operate in this area. Now, it's very clear. In fact, those who talk about sphere sovereignty in depth will recognize, and they have to articulate, that the different spheres that they try to describe, government, church, family, those different spheres actually do overlap.
Yeah, a lot.
And so when you start trying to say to the government, you have no authority here, let's say in the family, well, then you have to then turn around and say, well, okay, I guess you do when people are abusing their children.
Right.
Or you have no authority here in the church. Oh, well, I guess you do when it comes to like codes about maximum occupancy in a building. And so there's these areas of overlap, and the distinctions are not always clear. I just think it's very helpful as a political philosophy to readjust what government does. I think we would wish for that. But I think this is a safer starting point for us as Christians in terms of our attitude towards authority and submission in society.
Well, welcome back to the Tube Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing our BASiS series that Tom's been taking us through for the last 4 Sundays in 1 Peter 2, 11 through 17. So we've walked through the passage now from the pulpit. We've been given some really clear and helpful principles, and our goal today is just have a discussion to take those principles and apply them to a lot of various scenarios that you guys have asked us about, scenarios we've discussed, mostly stuff that Tom has been working on and thinking through as he's been doing this series. So this will be a multi-part series. The goal here is just to equip you to take those principles and apply them, be ready to apply them in whatever situations the Lord brings us into as a church and individually over the coming years as we try to take His word and apply it faithfully to our lives. So we hope this will be a blessing to you. And right now, we're just going to get right into the conversation. So, Tom, I thought it'd be helpful for me to just start by reading the passage, and then we can walk through your 10 summary principles. I was thinking about originally summarizing each sermon, but I thought your principles do that for us, and that'll then give us the framework we're going to use to hopefully have the discussion. So I'm going to read from 11, as you did throughout the series, to give us the context.
Go for it.
1 Peter 2, 11 through 17 says, Beloved, I urge you, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So it took you 4 sermons to work through that, and your summary of that was these 10 principles, and I'm going to say one, and then if you want to add any comments from it, that's fine. But this is the summary you sent out to our fellowship groups yesterday, and I thought it was good. So the 10 principles that come from these, 5 verses. First, you, Christian, must adopt a fundamental position of submission. That's what we get from the overarching command, the imperative in verse 13, be subject. That's the overarching framework for this whole pericope. The second principle, you must have this attitude toward every authority structure that governments invent. So this is the extent of that command. Anything that humans have come up with that's enforced and invented by the government, we have a fundamental position of submission to it. And then he gave us motives. The third principle, you must do this first because you love God. This is for the Lord's sake. Second, you must do this because you appreciate God's purpose for government, which is to punish evil and to praise good. And third, you do this so that by doing good, you silence foolish critics. That was helpful, giving us those overarching motives for our submission. And then with the last sermon, you were looking really at verses 16 and 17, and you said these principles. Principle number 5, you must do it so that by doing good you silence. Oh, sorry, I just said that. Nope. So you must do this so that by doing good you silence foolish critics.
You did just say that.
I did just say that. Thank you.
Number F.
Number F. Yeah, number F. It's helpful to change the numbers to letters. You must only submit as a free man. You must evaluate every command from the authorities. You must never abuse your freedom as a cover-up for evil. And you must not trust your sinful flesh because it will try to take advantage of your freedom. And so then the last principle you gave, principle 10, you must only ever submit to authority as a slave of God. And maybe just before we get into it, if you can briefly recap the difference between the free man and the slave that we see in that passage. So
Yeah, I mean, that's where this, I think, is so helpful, because in the past, people have been asking the question, well, the commands in 1 Peter 2, the commands in Romans 13, the commands in Titus chapter 3 seem to be unqualified. They're very stark, they're very plain. We must be in this position of submission to authority. And the question comes, well, what are the qualifications? We know that there are some qualifications to those commands to submit, because, well, Peter said, should we judge for yourselves if we should obey God rather than you? And that there is that requirement upon us as Christians to refuse to obey authority when the authorities are requiring us to do something that God forbids, or forbidding us from doing something that God requires. But then the question comes, well, is there any more to that freedom that we have? And I think this is where 1 Peter 2 is very helpful, because in verse 16, effectively, Peter is saying we are to submit as people who are free, as someone who is free, as opposed to being required to submit as a slave. And this is really the dichotomy in the Greco-Roman world between someone who was considered to be a free man in terms of their status. There were only two classes of human in that world. There were free men, and then there were slaves, the eleutheroi and the douloi. And that was it. The whole of society, the whole of humanity was categorized into one of those two classes. The freemen, well, they had to obey, but only if there was a law requiring it, or they were not allowed to do something only if there was a law forbidding it. And so the question that a free man had, and the question that he could ask when he was told to do something by some random chap on the street, the question he could ask is there a law against it? Or is there a law requiring me to do this? And so it's in that sense that I was saying on Sunday, we are to submit as people who are free. And because we're required to submit in that way, and the contrast in the text is, well, we must submit as slaves of God. We must be slaves in our submission to God. That's absolute submission. That's unquestioning submission. That's you don't get to challenge kind of submission. A slave in that society could not challenge the legality of what they were being told to do.
Right.
If they were commanded to do something that was a crime, the responsibility for that was upon their master. Well, that's exactly not the kind of submission that we owe to the authorities, and that was my point. In all of this, that we're to submit as people who are free. We're to submit, in other words, with a questioning obedience, a questioning submission. we're to have this disposition of submission. That's what's commanded in verse 13. But then we're to be those who say, well, is what you're commanding me to do right? Or is it wrong? If it's right, I'll do it gladly. If it's wrong, I'm sorry, I'm a slave of God. And that's really the fundamental difference. I think that is helpful because it introduces this requirement for us to be constantly evaluating what we're being commanded to do.
So when we're thinking about evaluation, if we take a step from those principles you gave, you discussed during the sermon series a couple times about that in general, our approach to evaluating the government's commands is generally on one of two sides. There's the person who is maybe essentially rebellious or critical, who hears something and says, why?
It's me.
And then there's the person who is maybe more on the submissive, I'm okay with authority, works for me. That's more my disposition. I'm going to go ahead unless I get some sort of red flag that I can pick up on. I'm just going to go along with it.
And some people are like that just because they want to stay out of trouble.
Yeah.
Other people are like that. Other people are like that from a point of principle, and those are two different things. If you're just being submissive because you don't want any problems, you're actually going to need to hear the command that you must only ever submit as someone who's free, and you must be a slave of God. That means you've got to be willing to say no to the government. And this is something Greg Fraser has brought out very helpfully. One of the duties that we have to government as believers is the duty to refuse to obey when the government requires us to do something that's wrong. What I'm stressing here in 1 Peter 2 is the duty we have to evaluate everything that we're told to do. We must submit as people who are free. We must submit as slaves of God. And that's what I found so helpful and for me new about the understanding the grammar here, looking at the way these clauses in verse 16, they don't have the verbs that the English translations put in. They just each start effectively with the word as eleutheroi, not as using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as slaves of God. And those three phrases form like a modification to the command to submit in verse 13. That I found really helpful because it puts on us this requirement to be conscious and careful about how we submit. So if you're someone whose disposition is, I'm going to submit to stay out of trouble, well, you've got to take this admonition. If your disposition, is someone more, something more like mine, which is why are you telling me to do something? I want to question authority as a natural disposition. Well, I've got to really take the admonition to be fundamentally in a position of submission. Those two extremes can be dealt with here in the same text.
So that's maybe the freeman slave qualifications in verse 16 help us wrap our minds around how to submit specifically from the text, and they help both ends of those default responses. They correct potentially sinful or lazy or uninformed default positions that we would have. So one thing that you mentioned in the series a couple times that I think a lot of us are familiar with in one way or another from the post-COVID working through this as a global church, working through submission to government, is sphere sovereignty. That's a term that I think a lot of us think we might understand. Maybe we don't understand as much as we should, but I know you've studied that a lot, and maybe you can give us your thoughts on sphere sovereignty in relation to the principles you just gave.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So sphere sovereignty, something Abraham Kuyper, Dutch theologian, pastor, became a politician, prime minister. He really developed it as a political philosophy. He wanted to reform the way government was done, and he actually ended up going into politics and trying to readjust the way government was run in the Netherlands, and I've got to say I have a lot of admiration for it as a political philosophy. If you were going to readjust the way our own government was run, I could wish that the government would adopt this, because it basically minimalizes the sphere of government and allows for other spheres of authority to exist within society. It recognizes the you would say the sphere of authority that a family may have over its own affairs, and that the church has over its own affairs. And it says to the government, look, don't intrude on the church, don't intrude on the family. And there's a lot to like about that, but it's very hard from my perspective to follow a clear line of biblical argument to arrive at that. It's very clear that Kuyper developed it as a philosophical concept, and although there's a lot of reference to biblical texts here and there, there's not a very clear textual development of the idea. I think actually this passage in 1 Peter 2 and this idea of our submission to the authorities as people who are free, as free men on the one hand, but then also as slaves to God, I think it's a much safer, much more helpful place to begin. I think the danger with sphere sovereignty is that as Christians, as those like myself who are given towards a rebellious disposition, the danger for us is to take it and use it as a way of saying to government, like Gandalf, you shall not pass. You have no authority here. I think that's not Gandalf, that's one of the other magicians saying to Gandalf, you have no authority here. You do not get to operate in this area. Now, it's very clear. In fact, those who talk about sphere sovereignty in depth will recognize, and they have to articulate, that the different spheres that they try to describe, government, church, family, those different spheres actually do overlap.
Yeah, a lot.
And so when you start trying to say to the government, you have no authority here, let's say in the family, well, then you have to then turn around and say, well, okay, I guess you do when people are abusing their children.
Right.
Or you have no authority here in the church. Oh, well, I guess you do when it comes to like codes about maximum occupancy in a building. And so there's these areas of overlap, and the distinctions are not always clear. I just think it's very helpful as a political philosophy to readjust what government does. I think we would wish for that. But I think this is a safer starting point for us as Christians in terms of our attitude towards authority and submission in society.
Yeah, and I would even say, if I'm going to represent the more submissive side, I think that sphere sovereignty can be used in the same way. I think it was to say, well, hey, this isn't our sphere. We just got to do that, and not thinking enough as a freeman to say, well, hold on, is there actually authority here biblically? So I think your comment that it can be used by a rebel to say no, I think it can also be used by someone who fears conflict to say, okay, I got to throw up my hands here.
Right. And in the history of the church, that's been the case. So Lloyd Jones articulated this, the basic different views of the role of the state. The Erastian view of the role of the state is this idea that the state is above the church, and the state gets to dictate to the church what it does. Well, that's a very comfortable view when it comes to questions of authority and submission in society. For those who are given to just not wanting to ever have to rebel against the state, well, to be able to just say, well, if the state says so, we must do so. It also allows people historically in positions of power and influence in the church to bow to the state and to say, well, if the state says so, we must do so, because that's the realm of the state. It's got nothing to do with us, and the state is sovereign in civil matters. And the church is sovereign in church matters, and so we don't have to evaluate that. I think that's where 1 Peter 2 again.
Yeah, it's really helpful. So we're not necessarily saying sphere sovereignty is a explicitly biblical approach to government and authority that we can use to decide what God wants, but it is a helpful way of using that discernment that Peter's calling us to have as free men to help pick apart this issue. Who's actually in charge of making the decision in this issue in God's eyes? And I need to start kind of, at least gives me a starting point for addressing that and starting to
Yeah, we'll
break
come
it
back to it
down.
later when we break it down over different issues, but I think the it's very unhelpful to start with sphere sovereignty and to come to the question of obedience and submission with sphere sovereignty in the background as a kind of a get out of jail free
Sure.
option as to whether I really have to submit to the government or
Sure.
not.
Sure.
I think it's very interesting. I've read a couple of books which are written by friends of mine, 3 different books written by friends of mine, all of which argue from the perspective of sphere sovereignty. Now, I've read them repeatedly. I've read them with this text in mind. I've read them thinking, okay, well, the arguments that I'm finding with regards to obedience and submission to government, the questions that they're raising with regards to whether we need to submit to government in this particular scenario or not. The answers that they give based on sphere sovereignty, every time I've been able to answer from the perspective of 1 Peter chapter 2 as to whether, in fact, we owe obedience primarily as a slave of God. We must question whether we ought to submit, seeing as we're free people. Once you accept that, and you accept also that you're a slave to God and you must do what God requires, I haven't found any particular issues that they have raised as examples in which I've not been able to answer it from this perspective. And so I came back to this repeatedly thinking, well, this seems to be a missing feature of the whole debate. Perhaps 1 Peter 2 has the answer for a better approach to handling this question of submission and authority.
Well, that's really helpful. So, I mean, the point of this series is for us to take this stuff and start saying, okay, great, we've got the principles. Now, what about the actual, let's put it into practice. Obviously, you and I were not involved in each person's individual scenario. So when we start talking about taxes and laws and family issues and all that kind of stuff, we're not necessarily saying, hey, anonymous question asker, this is the answer to your situation. What we're trying to do is take these principles and try to apply them more specifically. But I think it's fair to start out by saying it's each person's conscience before the Lord. They need to take these principles and handle them properly. Probably best to start where you were able to be really explicit in series sermon 3 of the series talking about taxes. So starting there, I think probably the biblical texts in the New Testament are more direct about taxes than they are about other things. So that helps us take some of this stuff, apply it to specific issues that obviously hit close to home for all of us, because taxes just hurt no matter how it works. So maybe we can just ask, basically, obviously, the basic fundamental position is if the government says it's a tax, you pay your taxes. Christians pay their taxes. But the immediate questions that come to mind, well, if my tax payment is going towards sin, is supporting DEI, abortion, unjust wars, do I still have to pay?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Next question.
Yes, of course. I mean, ultimately, you've got to ask about the setting that this was given in. It's very simple. Peter was writing under Roman rule. He was writing to the Christians in Turkey, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. They were areas which were under Roman governance in effect, and it was incredibly unjust. The taxation system was providing the income for people who who abused it, who lived off it sumptuously, and who pocketed the excess. You see that tension in the Gospels where the tax collectors were despised for their role, and you've got tax farmers who were effectively buying the ability to manage the taxes for a region and then living very handsomely off the profit of that. They're all serving Rome. Rome's happy as long as the tax is being paid. At the end of the day, the whole system from a believer's point of view is corrupt, and yet Jesus says, pay your taxes. And he says, pay your taxes to Caesar. And it's just so offensive. It's offensive to Jewish sensibilities. It's offensive to all our sensibilities when we consider the unrighteous things that they do with them. But that's not the point. So Jesus's basic point is, well, Caesar is the one, you would say, administrating the state. Because Caesar is administrating the state, Caesar has the right to collect taxes, to pay for the administration of the state. It's a very simple calculation, and Jesus doesn't say pay your taxes up to a point. He doesn't say pay your taxes only under these circumstances. He just says pay your taxes. So Christians don't really have a get out of jail free card there. I know people have used it. People have used it, but I think they've abused it to try to get out of paying any kind of taxes. I think some of you Americans did that at some point.
Listen, I was not there for that, so.
But we could talk about reparations.
Maybe that's another. We could have another podcast on reparations.
Taxation without representation was definitely a live issue in Greco-Roman world. They did not have representation, but they did have taxation, and they started to pay their taxes. So I don't know what other reasons you guys came up with, but
I would say I have questions about the way everything played out. So let me just clarify this, because I think people in our church, in the West, we do enjoy, as much as we might have issues with the way the government does things, we do actually enjoy a measure of order and stability and oversight that many countries would actually really benefit from. And I think it's easy for us to see the injustice, see the sin, etc., and bemoan it and really mourn it, as we should. But sometimes we forget how bad it is out there and how much worse it has been, whether it's in Peter's time or even in other parts of the world today. So, for people who maybe aren't in our situation, but are in a situation where they're paying taxes, and it's the tax for fixing the road, right? And the road continues not to be fixed, and the guy in charge of administrating the road uses the tax money openly to buy whatever he needs so he can get across the road while no one else can. And you get to watch this as a sort of...
Well, I think we're getting to watch that as citizens play out. I mean, the potholes in British roads have become so bad, and we're still paying our taxes. You could say the same about local government administration. It's painful to watch your tax. Did you say dollars?
I didn't. I wrote that down, and I didn't say it. I said my tax payment.
I was expecting you to say tax dollars, but I think it's a daily experience for most British taxpayers to say, well, our government is wasting phenomenal amounts of money. We could do with a Department of Government Efficiency in Britain, and I'm sure you could still do with it over in the States. But the reality is, whether people are putting in their pockets or wasting it, it's the same thing. And it doesn't excuse us from the duty that Jesus gives us. If Jesus has commanded us to pay our taxes, we don't get to insert the exceptions. I mean, that's my basic principle, and I don't think you can argue around that. I've certainly seen people try. It seems like at the end of the day, they're trying to excuse something that they know is wrong.
So you're on the verge of saying the words evade taxes, and maybe we can talk about that for a minute, because I think there's the reality that, especially with complicated taxation systems, there are people who are actively avoiding, disobeying the command to pay taxes. And then there's also the reality that tax systems are made to have exceptions and qualifications, and um, a, there could be what some people call a moral gray area between just paying flat whatever it says you're due, and then having someone who knows the tax system help you navigate it so that you can avoid paying taxes. You don't necessarily need to pay if you knew the system. So I think there are some Christians who interpret the kind of commands we see in the New Testament to pay taxes as, trying to pay less taxes is not what we're allowed to do. We pay our taxes flat. Whatever they say, we pay it. And then the other Christians who say, well, if the government has given me a way to pay less taxes, then I'm going to take advantage of that.
Sure.
What do you think about that?
I think avoiding any overpayment of taxes is a question of stewardship, isn't it? So, I mean, if you're, I'd much rather give my money to the church or provide for my family than I would pay the government to waste it. If there's a way of paying the government less legitimately, then I'd take it. And I mean, for me, over the years, it's been a question of just, I don't understand it. I don't want to be second guessed by the government years later and find out I've got more to pay.
Yeah.
Go to an accountant. I say to them, please make sure that I pay all my taxes. They do a good job. I always look at it and think, I wish they could have found a way of me paying less.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, over decades, I've never had the government come back and say, oh, we're going to relook at your account, relook at your taxes. Thank God. The alternative approach where you're trying to push the boundaries on what is legal, and some accountants will operate on that issue as to, what you can get away with as opposed to what's legal. Well, then you're looking over your shoulder all the time.
Yeah.
And that's, if you go to Romans 13, the authorities bear the sword for good reason. If you don't want to have fear the one in authority, just do what's right. I mean, it's a very simple policy. And I think it's very simply played out in the way we pay our taxes.
So, and so I guess the principle then, if we're talking about what we've been talking about as a free man, if there's no law against it and there's, you're able to not pay certain taxes because you know that law exists and you qualify for it, that's being a free man. But the slave of God element means never at the cost of your honesty, never at the cost of your integrity. So you still need to be honest. You still need to be an open book. You still need to be, doing things in a way that is obedient to God.
And I'm sure we'll talk about the conscience a lot later, but never at the cost of your conscience.
Sure.
If you're going to lie awake at night, the thinking, well, I blurred the issue there. Well, that's not only not worth it, but it's sin. Whatever is not of faith is sin. You need to be able to say, with a clean conscience, I'm paying all the taxes that I should.
Yeah,
and that's painful, but it's not wrong. It's in fact something which, I argued in the sermon. If anyone's not seen that, my basic contention is a true Christian wants to pay their taxes, all of them.
Yeah.
And that's shocking in a world that doesn't want to pay taxes. Well, why would a true Christian want to pay their taxes? Ultimately, it's because they believe that God is right.
Yeah.
And our hope is not in this life.
So before we take our first break, let me try one more element of this. Because there's the legal taxes that the government has that we have already said are often not efficient, are often not effectively administered, all that kind of stuff, but we live in that world. What about situations where it's not a legal tax, but it's the bribe that has to be paid if you want the thing to get done? And you're in a situation where everybody knows, okay, the government says do this, this, and this, but then there's the unwritten fourth step, which is, and then pay the processing officer this amount because otherwise it's never going to get done. and you're in a situation where you're trying to obey the law, and you are, but you also have an unwritten law, a bribe that needs to be paid if this is going to get done. So that's a situation where often the government knows it's happening. They're not choosing to get involved. It's a system which ends up being a part of the system, and we as Christians are in it. How do we decide we're going to pay that bribe?
Like
not
an
pay the bribe?
unofficial tax.
It's basically, it's an unofficial taxation that when those systems start and they erode, eventually it becomes a part of the whole system, right? And how do Christians think about that? This comes up obviously in day-to-day life for many Christians around the world, but then specifically sometimes in the world of missions or ministry, it's if I want to get into this country, stay in this country, etc. I don't just apply for my visa. I have to also pay the person to get through or whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a bigger question than I can answer adequately. I mean, a few things come to mind.
Yeah.
When, first of all, you mustn't do anything that goes against your conscience.
Right.
If you can't square it with your conscience. And I've struggled with this over the years. I've had conversations with people in Eastern European countries who just, they'll go to the hospital to have a baby, and the midwife will not give them any pain relief until she receives a bribe. And what do? You pay, basically. It's supposed to be, the healthcare is supposed to be delivered. You're supposed to be getting that service, but they will just leave you there to suffer until you pay, and then they'll give you the pain relief. Now, I guess you could accept that as a form of theft from you, and just you give them the money. You allow yourself to be robbed in order to just get what you need. And I could see them kind of working through their consciences on that level, perhaps. The issue for me is with a bribe, when you're trying to get something out of somebody, and you are the one who is, you would say, breaking the law. So you're the one who is ignoring your conscience. You're paying this person to do something that they shouldn't do. And I think that's a situation which is so different and so clearly wrong in Scripture that I would say absolutely no to that. When the Roman officials kind of farmed out the ability to collect taxes, the tax collectors were so hated because, yes, they collected more taxes than they should, but they had the power of the Roman army behind them. And that's kind of the situation that you've got in so many less developed countries, less well-managed countries legally, and it's coming more and more, of course, to the West.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, okay. Well, good. Well, I guess we've got lots to cover still. We're going to talk about when the government, it has not just taxes, but intrusive laws that don't seem to fit in what the government should be talking about. We're going to talk about tyranny and revolution and war. We're going to talk about the conscience issues and whatnot. But I think it's a good time to wrap up the first episode, and we'll be back with more.
Excellent. All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, let's do it.